The courtroom buzzed with the kind of low murmur that precedes something monumental. Rows of people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their whispers carrying stories of why they were here, who they hoped would win, and what they thought the judge would decide. Among the sea of faces, one stood out. A young black boy sitting silently, his wide eyes taking in every detail around him. His presence seemed almost out of place, a stark contrast to the heavy tension filling the room. Dressed neatly in a white shirt and slightly oversized tie, he held an air of quiet determination that hinted at a purpose far beyond his years. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a gavel that seemed to weigh heavy in his hand, was deep into the proceedings. His voice boomed as he addressed the court, reciting legal jargon that went over the heads of many in the room. For him, it was another day, another case. But something about today felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the boy. He had noticed him when he walked in, a solitary figure with an intensity that didn't match his age. But the judge dismissed it. He had rulings to make, a justice to serve. The case being discussed wasn't a small one. It involved a high-profile dispute that had drawn media attention and packed the gallery with reporters, community members, and onlookers. The stakes were high and the tension crackled like electricity. Yet, as arguments flew back and forth between the attorneys, the boy remained silent. His eyes darted between the lawyers and the judge, his hands clutching the edge of the bench in front of him as if bracing himself. Then it happened. A pause in the argument gave way to an eerie silence, the kind that settles in just before something unexpected occurs. The boy stood up. His small stature didn't command attention at first, but the sharp scrape of his chair against the floor turned every head in the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the judge's eyes locked onto him, surprised by the audacity. "Young man," the judge said, his tone firm but curious. "This is a court of law. Do you understand the seriousness of this moment?" The boy nodded, his face resolute. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, curiosity mixing with disbelief. "I do, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, though soft. There was a weight in his tone, something that hinted at a story much bigger than anyone had anticipated. "Then you must also understand," the judge continued, his voice softening slightly, "that interrupting the court is not something to be taken lightly. Do you have something important to say?" For a moment, the boy hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on him. Then he took a deep breath and spoke 2 words. The judge froze, his face so composed and authoritative just moments ago turned ashen. It was as if the boy's words had sucked the air out of the room, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. The attorneys stopped mid-motion, and the gallery sat in stunned disbelief. Whatever had just been said, it was enough to shake the very foundation of the court. The boy's gaze never wavered, meeting the judge's pale, wide-eyed stare with a mix of innocence and determination. His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of something far greater. Whatever truth he had spoken, it was clear it couldn't be ignored. And just like that, the courtroom was no longer the same. The judge, visibly shaken, fumbled for words, his usual confidence replaced by an unease that no one in the room had ever seen before. The boy had done what no one else could. He had interrupted the system, thrown it off balance, and revealed something that no one had expected. "What had he said? Why had it left the judge so stunned? And what would happen next?" As the room buzzed with unanswered questions, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of a story that would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew.
The room remained frozen in shock, every eye darting between the boy and the judge. The 2 words he'd spoken still hung in the air, their weight palpable, though no one dared repeat them. The judge's knuckles tightened on the edge of his bench. His lips pressed into a thin line as he tried to regain his composure. "Approach the bench," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. The boy glanced briefly at the woman sitting beside him, a social worker whose face now wore a mixture of concern and bewilderment. She gave him a hesitant nod, and the boy stepped forward. His small shoes tapped softly against the floor, the sound amplified in the otherwise silent courtroom. The judge leaned down as the boy approached, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Repeat what you just said," he demanded, though there was an undercurrent of something else, fear, perhaps, or maybe disbelief. The boy met the judge's eyes, his voice unwavering. "I said, you know." The judge leaned back as if struck. His face drained of all color, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might not speak again. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly. "Court is adjourned for a short recess," he said abruptly, banging his gavel with more force than necessary. The gallery erupted into a cacophony of murmurs as people speculated about what had just happened. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, while others tried to catch the boy as he was escorted out of the courtroom by the social worker. The boy walked silently, his head held high. He didn't flinch under the weight of the questions thrown his way, nor did he react to the whispers of the curious onlookers. Behind him, the judge sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the courtroom doors. In the hallway outside, the social worker crouched to the boy's level. "What did you mean by that, sweetheart?" she asked gently, her voice tinged with worry. "Why did you say those words to the judge?" The boy's eyes welled up, but he didn't cry. "Because he does know," he said simply. "He knows what happened to my dad." The social worker's heart sank. She had been assigned to the boy's case just a few weeks ago, after his father's disappearance had sparked a whirlwind of unanswered questions. There had been whispers of foul play, of corruption, but nothing concrete. And now this boy, this quiet, unassuming child, seemed to believe that the judge held the answers. Back in the courtroom, the judge remained seated, his hands trembling as he reached for a glass of water. His mind raced, replaying the boy's words over and over. He thought back to the case from years ago, the one he had worked so hard to forget. It was a case that had tested his ethics, pushed the boundaries of his morality. And now, somehow, this boy knew. The recess stretched on longer than usual, the tension in the courthouse building with every passing minute. The judge's chambers were locked, and inside, he sat in a chair, staring at an old photograph on his desk. It was of a group of men, himself included, standing in front of a courthouse years ago. He traced the faces with his finger, pausing on one man in particular, the boy's father. How could this child know? He had been just a toddler at the time, and yet there was no mistaking the clarity in his eyes or the conviction in his voice. Meanwhile, the boy sat quietly in the waiting area, his hands folded in his lap. The social worker stayed close, her protective instincts kicking in, but even she couldn't shake the sense that something much bigger was at play. "Why do you think the judge knows about your dad?" she asked softly, hoping to draw him out. The boy looked up at her, his expression heartbreakingly serious. "Because my dad told me," he said. The social worker frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean? When did he tell you?" "Last night," the boy said, his voice calm, though his words sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated. "But your dad has been missing for months." The boy nodded solemnly. "I know, but he came to me in a dream. He told me to find the judge and say those words. He said it would make him remember." The social worker's breath caught in her throat. She didn't believe in dreams as messages, but there was something about the boy's unwavering belief that made her pause. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than either of them could fully comprehend. As the courtroom prepared to reconvene, the tension reached a fever pitch. Everyone knew something monumental was about to happen, though no one could predict exactly what. The judge reappeared, his face drawn and pale, and took his seat at the bench. His gaze lingered on the boy, who looked back at him with the same steady intensity. The room fell silent once again as the judge's words hinted at a revelation that would change everything. The courtroom fell into a tense stillness as the judge leaned forward, his hands clasping the edge of the bench. His face, lined with the wear of years and responsibility, betrayed an inner struggle. The boy, still standing bravely in the center of the room, seemed unshaken by the weight of the moment. The judge cleared his throat, his voice low and measured as he began. "Years ago," the judge said, his words heavy, "there was a case that came through this court, a case that involved your father." His gaze flickered to the boy, who stood motionless, his eyes locked on the judge's. "It was a complicated matter, with layers of truth and lies twisted together. I made decisions then that I thought were just, but they haunted me every day since." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The murmurs of reporters and spectators filled the room, but the boy stood steady, as if he had expected this moment all along. "What happened to my dad?" the boy asked quietly, his voice carrying more power than the judge's gavel ever could. The judge hesitated, a lump forming in his throat. "Your father was a brave man," he began. "He uncovered something, evidence of corruption that reached into places no one dared to expose. He came to me with the truth, believing I would protect it." The judge's voice faltered, and he looked down, as if ashamed of what he had to say next. "I didn't," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I was scared. The people he was up against were powerful, and I thought I was protecting my family by staying quiet. I thought if I ignored it, it would all go away." Tears filled the boy's eyes, but he didn't look away. "At my dad?" he asked, his voice trembling now. The judge took a deep breath. After he presented the evidence, he disappeared. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I had no control over what happened to him. But I knew deep down that my silence made me complicit. I should have spoken up. I should have done something. The courtroom erupted into chaos, with voices shouting questions and accusations. The boy's small frame seemed to tremble under the weight of the truth, but he stood tall, his voice cutting through the noise. "You can still do the right thing," he said, his tone firm despite his tears. The judge nodded, his face pale but resolute. "You're right," he said. He turned to the court officers and spoke with newfound determination. "Bring me the files on that case. Every piece of evidence we have, no matter how old. This ends today." The hours that followed were a whirlwind. The evidence, long buried, was brought to light, revealing a network of corruption that had plagued the justice system for years. The boy's father had been right all along, and his bravery in exposing the truth had finally been vindicated. By the end of the day, the courtroom had transformed. The air was no longer thick with tension but charged with a sense of justice long overdue. The judge addressed the room one last time, his voice steady and clear. "To this boy and his father, I owe my deepest apology. And to everyone here, let this be a reminder. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Never again." As the court adjourned, the boy was swarmed by reporters and well-wishers, but he stayed close to the social worker, who had tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." The boy nodded but didn't smile. His thoughts were with his father, a man who had sacrificed everything to uncover the truth. As he walked out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over him, he felt a sense of peace. His father's voice echoed in his mind, the words from his dream now clear. Asterisk always, stand up for what's right. Asterisk. Though the journey had been painful, the boy had honored his father's legacy. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching that even the smallest voice could shake the foundations of power and change the course of history.